Good evening. My name is Xenia Makosky, and I'm a student project manager at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues here at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clarke Forum, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Ukraine-Russia War, Reflections After 1 Year. According to the Pew Research Center, approximately 78% of Ukrainians and 71% of Russians identify as Orthodox Christians. My family is also Orthodox, and this past weekend we celebrated Orthodox Easter, also known as Pascha, the most important feast in the Orthodox Church. I was able to attend church services this weekend, and early Sunday morning, we filled our giant family wicker basket full of sweet bread and dyed red eggs, salt, and butter, and carried it to church to be blessed. As I was preparing these traditional foods with my family, however, I could not help but think what it is like for Ukrainian Orthodox Christians who are celebrating this sacred feast in the middle of a war. I am sure that many Russian Orthodox families with absent family members are also feeling of the pain of the war too. In Ukraine, restrictions and curfews have prevented some worshipers from attending the traditional midnight service. And Ukraine's main security service urged residents not to linger in churches and to avoid large crowds over the weekend. The Russian and Ukrainian governments coordinated a prisoner swap for the holiday, but there was no ceasefire. Russian and Ukrainian shelling continued. According to the latest UN data from the Human Rights Office, over 8,000 civilians have been killed since the start of the war. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian military personnel have died, and nearly 18 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. To help us understand the current state of the Ukraine-Russia war and its regional and international economic, political, cultural, and social impacts are tonight's panelists. Russell Bova is the J. William Stuart and Helen D. Stuart Class of 32 Chair in International Studies here at Dickinson. His research specializes in Russian politics and Russian political culture. He is the author of How the World Works, A Brief Survey of International Relations, and his publications on Russian politics and democracy have appeared in journals such as World Politics, Soviet Studies, and Journal of Democracy. Alyssa DeBlasio is the John B. Parsons Chair in the Liberal Arts and Sciences and Associate Professor of Russian here at Dickinson College. She is the author of The End of Russian Philosophy, The Filmmaker's Philosopher Merhab Mardavashvili, and Russian Cinema, and a co-author of a new textbook published this year entitled Advanced Russian Through Film and Media. Andrew Wolff is an Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Dickinson College. In 2021, he was a Fulbright NATO Security Studies Scholar hosted by the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. His writing has appeared in the Journal of Transatlantic Studies, International Affairs, and Contemporary Security Policy. He is currently writing a book on multi-layered security governance in Europe. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clarke Forum welcomes differences of opinion, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our panelists. So Professor Bova, I wanted to start with you, and I was hoping you could just give us a brief update on what the state of the war is right now in Ukraine.
Yeah, my job for the next 5 minutes is to try and set the table for the discussion that's going to follow by trying to give you a good idea of what the state of play is in the war on the ground. Now, I think there are two ways you could assess that. One is by looking at control of terrain. Because of time constraints, I'm going to really zip through this part quickly because I've got the maps to help, but you can see what has happened over the course of the last 14 months. Prior to the February 22 invasion, this was the state of play. Russia controlled the area of Crimea going back to 2014, and you had this small area in the yellow that was controlled by Russian-backed separatists in the so-called Donbass region. The invasion occurs, and you can see that Russia fairly rapidly takes control of a good swath of Ukrainian land. This was the period, for example, in which we were all on pins and needles about what would happen to the capital of Kyiv. A year later, in March of 2023, Russia's control of land in Ukraine has shrunk considerably from a year before. So if you're looking at the map from the point of view of Ukraine, its progress. If you're looking at it from a different perspective, however, Russia still controls roughly 20%, a little bit short of 20% of Ukrainian territory. So that's the state of play in terms of control of the terrain. I think another way to look at it, though, and in many ways a more important way to look at the state of play, is to look at the men and material that each side has available to it as they continue to fight in the war. This war has turned into what military strategists would call a classic war of attrition. You have offensive and counteroffensives in both directions. And after each offensive or counteroffensive, each side has to assess what amount of men and material they have to fight in the days and weeks to come. In a lot of ways, this is the most important way of assessing where the war is heading. If you look at it from the Russian side, they have some problems. They are short of some key material, including artillery. They are using more on a monthly basis than they are producing. They are running out of precision-guided missiles, again, using more and having to ration their use in recent months. And they have lost quite a few personnel. Estimates by the US government suggest about 200,000 Russian casualties. Now that includes both injuries as well as deaths. But that is an extraordinarily high amount when you're talking about a war that's only a little over a year old. And if you extrapolate from that 200,000 figure of total casualties, the estimates are that they've actually lost about 50,000 lives. About 50,000 Russians have died. Now, those estimates are pretty murky. The U.S. intelligence community says they have, this is a low confidence estimate, which means it's basically an educated guess. But if we assume a figure somewhere in that range, if you want to think about it in comparison, the U.S. lost about 50,000 soldiers in 10 years plus of fighting in Vietnam. So again, an extraordinary loss of lives. This is in part why Putin had to engage in to enact the partial mobilization of reserve units back in September of this past year. I suspect, in addition, there's a good chance there will be another partial mobilization in Russia come the fall. And I say that for two reasons. Number one, they need the men. Number two, there is a new law that was just passed by the Russian Duma updating the process by which the conscription process in Russia will occur. Instead of getting a notice via email or even by snail mail, there will now be a notice deposited in an electronic service that Russians use for other purposes like taxes and so forth. It's clearly an effort to upgrade and make more efficient the process to avoid some of the difficulties they had with this process the last time around. Now, I should note that this new conscription approach is aimed really at conscription of young individuals in their early 20s who are not actually fighting in the war, but it can easily be adapted to calling up reservists, older individuals who have prior military experience. The Ukrainian side also is facing some challenges here. They are also running short of artillery. And in the new documents that have been just leaked, the so-called Discord files that we've all been reading about in the newspapers, one of the things that struck me most clearly, or more significantly, was an indication that the Ukrainians are running out of air defense missiles, the so-called S-300 missiles. This is important because over the past several months, the Russians have been bombarding Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure with missile strikes. The Ukrainians have been doing their best to fend them off with these air defense missiles, but because they are running short, they are now going to have to ration them and have to make difficult decisions about whether to use them to protect cities, to protect critical infrastructure, or to defend key military installations. And particularly, given the fact that the Russians are running out of precision-guided missiles and are likely to revert to the use of so-called dumb bombs, the prospects for what will happen to Ukrainian cities going forward are pretty bad. I'm thinking, for example, of the war in Chechnya and what happened in Grozny at that point. I think I'm getting the cue that I'm over time here, so let me stop.
Thank you. I want to transition a little bit and talk about the different methods of support for the war. So Professor DeBlasio, I wonder if you could answer this question, but how much support is there for the war right now in Russia and in Central Europe? Is the Putin regime in any sort of jeopardy?
This is one of the questions that's on everybody's mind, and like the issue of Russian military casualties, it's hard to answer because of the lack of reliable polling data. So many of the independent polling agencies, newspapers are now working in exile from outside of Russia. But there is one historically very reliable, very respected polling agency called the Levada Center that's working, still polling individuals within Russia. And the most recent data they have is from March 2023. And it's really under a month old at this point. And to the question, and they've been collecting data every few months since the beginning of the war. And so to the question, do you personally support Russian military action in Ukraine? 72% of those polled said yes, either strongly yes or somewhat yes. And they specifically use the term military action because if you remember, you cannot use the word war. Now it's opening up where the Russian media is using war, but at the beginning of the war, it had to be military operation or military action. So in order to protect the people they're polling, they refer to the war as military action. So 72% say yes, strongly yes or somewhat yes. 20% say no, either strongly no or somewhat no. And then 8% can't say. And these stats, if we actually parse out the other statistics that the agency has collected from the same group, they tend to align with people, so that 72% yes tends to align with people who approve of the president's activity, which makes sense, and whose main source of news is television. Then the next category is 55% or older, 55 years or older. So the older you are, the more likely you are in Russia to support the war. And then men. Men are more likely to support the war than women. Among young people, though, 18 to 24, 58% of people still say strongly yes or somewhat yes. And to the question, would you prefer military actions to be continued, or would you like to see peace talks? 44% say continuation of military action. 48% say negotiations, peace talk. So we're about even there. And then I think this is an interesting question. They ask the respondents, what feelings do Russian actions in Ukraine cause you? And the number one feeling reported is pride, 43%. But notable is the fact that it's down from 51% to the same question last year. So a decrease from 51% to 43% in the feeling of pride. The next adjective is fear, 35%, which is up from 31%. Shock, 10%. Anger, 10%. Depression and shame, both at 6%. So this is really the best data we have. I mean, I can give you anecdotal data, but that doesn't help us, right? This is the best the best set of statistics we have as for what the feeling on the war is in Russia right now. And finally, everybody asks about Putin's approval rating. As of April 2023, and this data was actually taken, the polling center polls on Putin's approval rating about every 2 weeks, so this is about 6 days ago. 82% approve, strongly approve, or somewhat approve Putin, and 15% disapprove. Now, that doesn't align with approval or disapproval with the government, so only 69% approve of the government. and 27% disapprove of the government. So you can see there's a strong approval rating of the president, but not as strong of the government. And that's really the best information we have right now as to what's happening in public opinion in Russia.
Thank you. Professor Wolff, what about the support in the West? I was hoping you could talk a little about that. What has been the impact of Western military and financial support for Ukraine, and can this level of support be maintained in the future?
So the level of support's been very, very high, both in material concerns and sort of political support. I would want to say, kind of make the contrast that, none of that support would work if it weren't for like the bravery, the perseverance, the creativity of the Ukrainian people. Because you can look at what happened in Afghanistan with the collapse of the Afghan government in the summer of 2021. They were highly armed and well equipped with Western equipment, and they didn't have the will to fight, where the Ukrainians clearly are showing a will to fight, and that actually kind of helps with support in the West. I want to give you a little bit, sort of a broad overview of what is support and kind of break down a little bit the different categories of support. In the first 13 months of the conflict, about a group of 40 countries, the West, plus some other Asian countries such as South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, some others, collectively donated about $155 billion worth of equipment, financial support, and humanitarian support to Ukraine. That's a huge amount of money, right? A huge amount of support. The U.S. specifically has donated $46 billion in military aid. That's money to buy military equipment and also donated military equipment. That is larger than all the other military donations combined. So if you want to think about it, the U.S. is really funding the military side of this war for Ukraine. The European Union's doing quite a lot as well. They're funding about $60 billion, but most of that is financial transfers, government to government, and some military aid as well, of course, but not at the level of the United States. I would note, as far as support, that the West has done a lot of very innovative things in terms of support. For example, the European Union, for the first time ever, is using EU funds to buy arms and deliver weapons to another country. And the EU is kind of funded to be sort of like a political and economic institution, not a military institution. So it's changing its stripes because of this war. More specifically about the types of support, you can look at, there's been training going on, right? The UK has a training program going right now for basic training for recruits, Ukrainian recruits. 5 weeks, they've trained about 10,000 soldiers. They're going to train another 10,000 over the next 6 months. There's a lot of training centers in Poland and Germany to train on specific Western equipment. There's a lot of intelligence sharing, which is very critical. From some reports, the West and Western intelligence services are able to provide real-time intelligence to the front lines for Ukrainians. So that means targeting, being able to locate where Russian military units are, et cetera, in real time, which is pretty astounding. And it takes a lot of close coordination for that to happen. Some of the support hasn't been from governments, it's been from private citizens. And I think key has been Elon Musk. He has donated thousands of Starlink internet satellite services. And what that has done is given the Ukrainian army an advantage in the field in that they can have communications, email, they can stream back video to headquarters, where the Russians can't do that. They don't have that capability, right? Because all the communication towers are knocked out in their region. So Starlink has really been sort of a game changer for the Ukrainians. And what all this equipment and technologies is doing is it's kind of allowing the Ukrainians to punch above their weight, so to speak, right? In terms of military equipment, I think it's noteworthy to see that it's been very incremental, and you can see the sort of the waves of equipment First, it was, shoulder-fired javelins, anti-tank missiles, and then Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and then longer-range rockets, HIMARS, and then in the fall, it was more anti-air defense equipment, Patriot missiles. In the fall, there was debates about armored personnel carriers, and in the winter, it was also about Leopards and other battle tanks that have been given to Ukraine. And now the debate is about F-16s and other, semi-modern Western jet fighters. And so you're seeing this be rolled out incrementally, which can be a little bit frustrating, but Ukraine can't digest all this material at once. Does that make sense? And as Professor Bova has already mentioned, the Ukrainians are running low on a lot of their ammunition, a lot of their stocks. And there's not just huge troves of old Russian ammunition lying around in the West. So this is a problem going forward, is that to support Ukraine, there may not be the capability for the West to do it at this intense level. Does that make sense? Because you can't switch out this military equipment to Western equipment, an entire army, while it's fighting. And finally, I do want to mention about political will. I think political will for support of Ukraine has been incredibly high, but I think it's at a high point. It's going to decline, and you can see that already here in the U.S. Both Democrats and Republicans, some wings of those parties, are starting to question this huge amount of money going towards Ukraine in support. And there's a budget crisis coming, debt ceiling debates, and once the 2024 presidential campaign kicks in, this is going to become more visible. And so I don't expect this level of support to be maintained over time, nor do I think the West can materially keep up this level of support. So, thank you.
Can I make a couple of comments on the things that were said before? Okay, thank you. First of all, on attitudes towards the war and Putin and Russia, Professor DeBlasio is quite correct that the one credible polling institution that is still operating inside of Russia is Levada Institute. But even there, I think some of the results that they produce are probably inflated, not because they're not trying to do good polling using good techniques, but the context in which this polling is being done, right? In the context of a regime that has become increasingly repressive, and where saying things against the war can get you into a lot of hot water very quickly. If somebody is asking you questions about your support for the war, or your support for Putin, that is likely to impact the way you're going to respond. So I suspect that these results of very high support for Putin in particular, and lesser so for the war, are probably a little bit inflated because of the context in which this polling is being done. Interestingly, there is an American company called Filter Labs that's trying to employ artificial intelligence to get around this. So before AI, takes over the human race, it is doing some things that are useful for us. And what this company is doing is they're using AI to reach into the deepest corners of the internet. They're looking at websites, online forums, as well as things like social media. And they're trying to track commentary that Russians are making in those contexts. And what they're showing is that in those kinds of contexts where people might, in some circumstances, feel more comfortable communicating with others that they know or on constricted websites, that the commentary in terms of support of the war has trended in a downward direction. So it's kind of an interesting use of that technology for that purpose. Just one quick comment on Professor Wolff's discussion of, or useful discussion of the issue of U.S. support. I think he's right that support for the war over time is likely to wane, particularly in the context of electoral politics. But one thing to keep in mind, all of this very significant U.S. financial and military support that we've given in Ukraine is equal to maybe about 5.5% of the U.S. military budget this past year. Now that adds up to a lot of dollars and cents, but if you think about it, right, 5.5% of the U.S. budget, right, being used to wage or to support the Ukrainians' efforts against one of the two great American geopolitical rivals. Depending on how you look at that, that is either a very large expenditure of money or a bargain, really, in some sense, given the amount that it adds up to in terms of our larger military spending.
And Professor Bova, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the opposite. We're talking about support, but how effective have Western tactics been to undermine the war, such as economic sanctions?
Okay, so yeah, economic sanctions are a good question and an important issue. First of all, note that economic sanctions do not have the greatest track record in general, aside from the Russian case. The record of success is, depending on what study you look at, 20, 30% success, and even in those cases, success is only partial. Think of some of the most sanctioned countries in the world today, right? Think North Korea, Iran. Sanctions imposed. In the case of North Korea, UN-supported sanctions in order to put a damper on their nuclear program. Well, how's that working? Not particularly well. We've had a comprehensive regime of sanctions against Cuba since 1960, without much success. We've had sanctions imposed on Syria and Myanmar because of human rights records, without much success. So sanctions are often a very attractive instrument for countries to utilize because it gives you the sense that you're doing something, but the record of success historically is mixed at best. That's one thing. You also have to ask yourself, what is your standard of success? Part of what sanctions do is cause pain, and that itself might be useful as a deterrent for other countries to do the same thing that the target of the sanction is being punished for. But pain itself is not the end of sanctions, right? The pain is supposed to be translated into a change of policy, into a political transformation. And that is where sanctions often fall short. So let me just give you one example. There are many different kinds of sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia. We've sanctioned individuals. Over 2,000 individuals and organizations have been targeted with individualized sanctions. We've had financial sanctions, freezing Russian funds, kicking them off the SWIFT transaction system. And we've also had a pretty comprehensive regime of export controls, preventing the sale of military-related or dual civilian military-related technologies to Russia, things like semiconductors. Let me give you an example of how Russia has been able to get around those sanctions. On the export controls, if you look at the data, in the month or two before the war began, Russian imports of many key products, things like semiconductors, skyrocketed. Right? In December of 21, January of 22, a huge increase in the import of those products. Putin, if he didn't know for sure that he was going to invade, he knew that that was a possibility and that sanctions would be the result. So they had stockpiles. There's also transshipment. Semiconductors somehow get from Kazakhstan into Russia. And then, of course, there are alternative sources, right? Russia turning to places like China. On the financial sanctions, well, we freeze Russian assets, but at the same time, the Europeans are still importing lots of oil from Russia during 2022, at a time when, because of the war, oil prices are skyrocketing. So this carve out for oil and for energy allows them to get around the impact of the sanctions. So in the short term, is it causing pain for Russia, for the Russian government, and for Russian citizens? Absolutely. Is that pain likely to be maintained if the sanctions are kept in place? Absolutely. In the long term, might it produce some change in policy? Possibly, but at least in the short term, they have not produced the kinds of impacts that I think we were hoping for.
And Professor Wolff, what about NATO? How has NATO responded to the war? I remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, there was a lot of press about Finland joining NATO. What does all this mean, if anything?
Yeah, good question. NATO's been, I think, fairly vigorous in its response towards the invasion of Ukraine. I say fairly because there's some caveats there from my point of view. NATO had already responded to Russian aggression in Ukraine after Russia annexed Crimea. And what they primarily did is they set up a number of battle groups in their eastern allies in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Poland. And these were set up in 2017, about 5,000 troops. They were multilateral, multinational groups, battle groups, so to speak. And that was the purpose is to deter the Russians from ever thinking of encroaching on a NATO member, right? And so when 2022 happened in February, NATO basically doubled that amount of battle groups. So now there are about 10,000 NATO troops in its eastern allies. And the number of battle groups doubled and the geographic coverage doubled as well, meaning there are now battle groups in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria as well. Okay, so that's been significant. NATO stepped up its air cap and air policing, including in the Balkans as well, and a lot of countries are participating in that. NATO countries in those activities. NATO also, over the summer, pledged to create a 300,000 person response force that would be able to be deployed to to the east, not to Ukraine, but to its eastern allies if they're attacked by Russia. This is mostly a paper force at the moment. It's cobbled together, but NATO's working on that and starting to do training. It's coming together. So that is fairly significant. And NATO's been very instrumental in coordinating with other institutions, such as the EU, and coordinating with allies on arms shipments and supplying the Ukrainians on military strategy, et cetera. But if you look at the impact on, say, NATO member state defense budgets, it's not that impressive. The year before the war started, 6 countries met NATO's 2% guideline. The guideline is that NATO countries should spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And only 6 out of 30 countries met that standard. Well, last year, 2022, 7 countries did. 1 more country added to the bunch. You would think a major war right on NATO's border, would have drastically increased defense budgets throughout the entire alliance. But that is not the case. They have gone up, but not spectacularly. Maybe in 2023 budget cycle, you'll see greater defense spending, but I'm not expecting anything startling to come out of this. So on the one hand, a very vigorous response, on the other, not so much, at least in terms of defense spending by each member state. The Finland question is really interesting, and I would throw in Sweden there as well. Finland joined NATO officially, becoming the 31st member just a couple of weeks ago. And this, I think, is rather significant. Look, one of his many justifications for invading Ukraine, just one, is that he was trying to prevent NATO enlargement. He was actually trying to stop the encroachment of Russia by the NATO alliance. But the funny thing is, his invasion actually prompted more NATO enlargement. At the time, NATO really wasn't looking to enlarge to Ukraine. Enlargement was mostly defunct. It was only happening in the Balkans, in places like Macedonia and Montenegro. But Russian aggression scared Finland and Sweden into applying for NATO membership. And look, this is startling politically because both of those countries are traditionally non-aligned. They're neutral. In the case of Sweden, they broke 200 years of tradition to apply to NATO. And so that's all on Russia. Russia calls that. And so it's fairly significant, I would say. Finland materially brings a very competent military force, about 30,000 man army. They have a huge reserve and very active reserve. And they double NATO's border with Russia. And what, strategically thinking, Finland, and this is very important, Finland allows for more credible defense of NATO's north, particularly of the Baltic states. It's much easier to defend those 3 small Baltic states with Finland just right across the Gulf of Finland. And so, and it means Russia has to worry about what's going to happen in the Arctic and in Scandinavia now that there's another large state, Finland, in the NATO alliance. So we'll see how this plays out, but I think it's rather significant.
I I agree with Professor Wolff, and just to add, once Sweden becomes a member, and I think that's likely to happen, the Baltic Sea essentially becomes a NATO lake at that particular point in time. So it is significant. I think the number is 280,000 if you add the reserves in, 280,000 troops. So that's not an insignificant number of soldiers added to NATO's military capability.
Yeah, transitioning a little bit off of support, I wanted to talk a little bit about the social and cultural impacts of the war. So Professor DeBlasio, how has the war impacted cultural spheres like literature, art, and film in Ukraine, Russia, and neighboring countries?
I think this question is so important because when we talk about the war, we tend to first be interested in the money, the social organizations, the strategy. And I think it's easy to forget that these are people's lives, and one of the best ways to kind of gauge the emotion around the war and the lived experiences is through art, literature, music, cinema. And something that Ukrainian artists, writers have been grappling with really since 2014 has been this process of self-decolonization, reclamation, of making sense of what a Ukrainian identity looks like when it's separated from the Soviet legacy and from the historical connection with Russia and other countries of the Soviet Union. And this is really coming out, especially since the start of the war, in art forms like poetry, right, which can be, and some forms of art, photography, which can be done in conditions of, under conditions of war, right, where some art forms like cinema are incredibly expensive, they take a lot of people, a huge amount of money, and so cinema is a slow art, and I'm actually interested in cinema because it's a slow art and because it's often funded by the government, and so you really see the connection between the art form and government policy. But those rapid art forms, not always, I'm generalizing here, but the art forms that can be produced in the bunker, like poetry, like photography, like art, we're seeing a real flourishing of that in Ukraine, and also an acceptance of that art in the West. There's finally a market for the translation of Ukrainian literature. Ukrainian poets have been trying to be translated into English for decades, and now, because of the war, there are translators working and making a living translating from Ukrainian into English and also from Russian into English, because Ukrainian writers write in Russian and in Ukrainian and in many other languages. And so I think, I don't like to talk about silver linings because that's the wrong kind of vocabulary for when we're talking about war. But one thing we see is that Ukrainian artists are being recognized for their work and are being incorporated now into classes here at other universities in ways that they maybe weren't before. In terms of what's happening in art and culture spheres in Russia, this is also interesting because also since 2014, with the sanctions that happened after 2014, and especially the additional sanctions in 2022 and this year, for instance, if we look at film, the Russian film industry has been entirely isolated from the West. And for the first time ever in 2022, Russian films made more money in Russia than Western films. So actually, it's been a sort of renaissance for the Russian film industry too, because now Russian filmmakers no longer have to compete with Hollywood because Hollywood's not present in Russia. So this is a funny thing that happens with sanctions, is that actually when sanctions are levied, we'll take Russia as an example, in 2014, you couldn't get Italian mozzarella anymore. And so you had mozzarella producers beginning to learn the art in Russia. And so sanctions can, funny enough, right, they can hurt a population deeply, but they can also encourage growth of industries that were not previously practiced within the country. So there's the double side to that.
Yeah, and you started to talk a little bit about language. So since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian has been the primary language of communication among the territories, correct? So what is the status of the Russian language currently in the region?
This is a really good question too, and I think it's important when we talk about language, because language, status of the Russian language, Ukrainian language, these are really hot topic questions today around the war, and it's important to keep in mind that Russian language is not equated with Russia. So there are 260 million people who consider themselves native speakers of Russian in the world, and the population of Russia is only 143 million. And there are over 150 indigenous groups in Russia, and many of them use Russian as their primary and sometimes only language. So when we talk about, right, there have been calls to reduce the use of Russian, to stop the teaching of Russian, right, to move away from Russian, I think that's a dangerous position, because that assumes that Russian is equated with Russia, or it assumes also that Russia is equated with a pro-Kremlin position. And for instance, in Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian poetry, there are Ukrainian writers who speak and write in both languages and have made choices to only use Ukrainian now. That's a popular position. There are also Ukrainian writers for whom Russian is their primary artistic language. And so you can see arguments on both sides. Right? An artist can say, I don't want to use Russian anymore. And I have colleagues who I speak with them in Russian because they realize that with me, this is an instrument for our communication. But in their professional work, they've chosen to move predominantly to Ukrainian. I also have colleagues who really only speak Russian. And to try and limit the use of Russian is then to tell, especially if we're talking about Ukraine, is to be telling Ukrainians what language they should speak. And I think that's a decision that's up to Ukrainians. Ukrainians right now, right, their country is under attack, their identity is under attack, and it's up to them to determine which language they want to use and why they want to use it. To keep in mind, when we talk about language, I think it's important here to remember that about 67% of people living in Ukraine consider Ukraine to be their only native language. 17%, about 17.5%, both Ukrainian and Russian, and then 14% Russian only. So that's about 67, 68% Ukrainian only, and 31% either Russian only or both Ukrainian and Russian. So that's where the language split falls, and this is a really contentious and really painful question for many people now as Ukrainians think ahead to what the future of the Russian language looks like in Ukraine. And the answers, and this is anecdotal for the people that I've spoken with, the scholars, the artists, the filmmakers, but it really depends on the individual and the weight that they attach to certain languages. Many people have different stances on that. And again, I think that's up to, we should let Ukrainians make that choice.
And looking at the future and where we go from here, I have a question for both you, Professor Bova and Professor Wolff. What are the risks of escalation and the risks of this conflict spreading? And how seriously should we take Putin's threats of nuclear war? Professor Bova, if you want to start us off.
Sure. On the nuclear question, I tell my students that nuclear weapons have dramatically shaped the contours of this war already, even though they have not been utilized. Students who have taken the introductory international relations class probably remember the stability and stability paradox concept, which basically says nuclear weapons can create stability at the nuclear level while actually exacerbating instability at the conventional level. What does that mean in this context? Well, let's look at Putin's decision to invade. He doesn't want a war with NATO. It's a war he probably understands that he would lose. And he certainly doesn't want a nuclear war with NATO. But he calculates that he could invade Ukraine precisely because he knows that the United States does not want a direct confrontation with Russia either. So in invading Ukraine, he makes the calculation that the United States will be deterred from becoming directly involved in the war, conventionally or at the nuclear level, precisely because the United States does not want a great power war between these two countries, right? And clearly that's what the Biden administration has done, right? He has said from the very beginning there will be no American troops fighting in the war in Ukraine. So we have been deterred by nuclear weapons, and it potentially impacted his decision to go to war in the first place. At the same time, Putin has been deterred by nuclear weapons. Think of all of the Western military equipment making its way through Poland into Ukraine. that has helped to kill 50,000 Russian soldiers. You would think that there would be a reason for Putin to try and interdict those supply lines with attack on the source. Again, he is going to be deterred from doing that because of the concern with the war going nuclear. So, putting aside for the moment the question of whether or not his nuclear rhetoric is something we should take seriously or whether it is just a lot of nuclear static that is intended as a bluff, nuclear weapons have to some extent already shaped the way this war has played out. Let me stop and give Professor Wolff an opportunity to weigh in.
Yeah, Professor Bova, I think you framed that very well, and I agree with your idea of deterrence. I would say, the risk of nuclear war was incredibly small before this conflict. Now it's incredibly small. I mean, just a little bit more greater. So I wouldn't say incredibly small, but very small, to use a different adjective. Meaning the risk of nuclear war, I think, has gone up because of this conflict, but it's not very significant, and I wouldn't worry about it. I just don't see Putin using tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil that he says is Russian territory. They're fighting in what, according to Russia, is Russian territory. So I don't think he would do that. And then, of course, strategic long-range nuclear weapons striking the West, that deterrence holds there. So I don't think that's going to happen. What I worry about is conventional escalation. I do worry about this conflict spilling over and sucking in other countries. And there have been a lot of near misses of that already. I think it might happen. The chances are much greater this would happen. What do I mean? For example, Belarus could, invade along with Russia in a sort of a second invasion, and there are rumors of that. Russia could make a move on Moldova, and they instigated a coup in February of this year in Moldova, and there are already troops there. So that would be an expansion of the conflict to a third country. There are rumors that North Korean troops might go and fight in Ukraine. That would be an expansion of the conflict. And I think in all those cases, NATO would have to respond and escalate and intensify, maybe even get directly involved. You also have the scenario of an accident happening, a missile or something being lobbed and accidentally killing citizens. This has already happened in Poland. 2 citizens were killed, but it was a Ukrainian missile that went errant and fell onto a farm in Poland. But if it was Russia that did that, it would be a political crisis. And Russia could actually start targeting Western assets. They already did it in the Black Sea just a couple of weeks ago by downing a U.S. Predator or Reaper drone. And if that happens again and the U.S. doesn't respond, NATO doesn't respond, that's a problem. I think they would respond. So all it takes is one little incident, and then the war has expanded and heightened and involves more players directly.
Professor Wolff tried to make us all feel better by suggesting that the risk of a nuclear war was very low, and I think I agree with that, right? However, just for fun, let me make you a little bit more worried. I think one issue that concerns me with respect to nuclear escalation is Crimea. I think for Putin, that is a red line. I'm not saying that he would automatically, go to the nuclear button if that were to occur, but losing Crimea would probably be the end of the Putin regime. And at that point, I don't know what the response would be. Now, I think Professor Wolff is right. He's not going to use a nuclear weapon, in the Donbass region, which he has now annexed illegally, right, into Russia. And I don't think he would use a nuclear weapon to change the course of sort of the battle on the ground. I think he would use one more as kind of what we in the West would call a shock and awe tactic, right? Dropping a small tactical nuclear device, not in the Donbass, not in eastern Ukraine, but somewhere in western Ukraine. Find some railway depot, right, which has been an important transit point, near Lviv, right, in the western Ukraine. As a way of signaling, right, that we are about to cross the red line. Do I think he's likely to do that? No, I think Professor Wolff is right. The odds are low, but the stakes are so high, right? I can't, feel comfortable, right, about my prediction that he won't.
And one more question for you, Professor Bova, with the future. What are the prospects for prosecution of Putin and others for war crimes at the International Criminal Court?
Okay, yeah, so if you've been following the news recently, you know that Putin has been formally indicted by the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is a relatively new body. It was created in 1998 by the Rome Statute, started hearing cases in the early 2000s. And he's been indicted for war crimes specifically related to the kidnapping of Ukrainian children and bringing them back to be raised as Russians. Neither Ukraine nor Russia is a member of the International Criminal Court. So how is it the International Criminal Court can have jurisdiction over this case? As it turns out, there is a provision in the Rome Statute that created the court. It's called Article 12. And it says that any country that is not a member of the court can request that the court investigate war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity that are occurring on its territory. Ukraine issued not just one, but two Article 12 declarations back in 2014 and 2015 in response to the Russian invasion of Crimea. The second of those two declarations was open-ended and is still in force. So the International Criminal Court has every right, legally under the Rome Statute, to investigate war crimes of the sort that Putin is accused of engaging in Crimea. The court, however, will not try people in absentia, right? And so unless Putin can be captured and brought to The Hague and to put on trial, right, a trial and an imprisonment of Putin on these charges is only a theoretical possibility. It does limit his ability to travel. He's supposed to go to South Africa shortly for a BRICS conference. South Africa is a member of the International Criminal Court. They should be, under the rules of the court, be obliged to cooperate the court and to detain those who are indicted. The South Korean government has been non-committal to that effect. But there are many other countries in the world, even if he ends up going there, where he would have to be very careful about traveling. One downside of this is I do worry a little bit at what it means for some possibility, however remote, of a negotiated settlement for the war. I think we're a long way from that. Neither Ukraine nor Russia is in a situation right now where they think a negotiated settlement would make sense for them. But my hope is at some point down the road, right, we get to that point, the indictment of Putin might actually make it more difficult to reach that settlement because A, you'd have to be, first of all, negotiating with an indicted war criminal, and B, that war criminal would have to reach an agreement without necessarily being freed of the indictment that's hanging over his head. So I think it might very well complicate, right, those negotiations down the road.
Much for being here. We will now start the question and answer portion of tonight's event. So just a reminder that this event is being live streamed. So if you would just raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We do always reserve the first question for students, but after that, anyone in the audience is welcome to ask a question. And with that, I will come this way.
So thank you so much for your insights. My question will probably go for Professor Bova, but if the other members of the panel wants to weigh in, I mean, it's fine. Since you talked at the beginning about the situation of the war on the ground, I wanted to ask you, well, we kind of saw how the incredible ability of the Ukrainian army to be able to disrupt the ground lines of operations of the Russian military and to counter Russian invasions, especially I think the case of Kharkiv and how they were able to disrupt ground lines of operation around Kramatorsk and Izium was incredibly effective. What we didn't see really was the targeting of ground lines of communication, so supply lines. We saw some kind of targeting of oil refineries within the Russian border, but really, and probably it's a matter of capabilities, we didn't see like a specific targeting of supply lines. So what I wanted to ask you is, as the war, as you said, is becoming increasingly a war of attrition, and assuming that new Western technologies or fighter jets will be delivered to Ukraine, may we see a possibility of a shifting strategy and from the Ukrainian military starting to targeting supply lines and ground lines of communications as a kind of a new type of strategy rather than focusing exclusively on ground lines of operations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And particularly if you're referring specifically to targeting supply lines and logistics in Russia itself, right? That has been an issue with which the Biden administration has attempted to draw very sharp lines, right, around the aid that they're giving to the Ukrainians, right? Biden administration, the United States, and the Europeans, for that matter, are very concerned about the escalation of the war, right? To the extent that the Ukrainians take the war to Russia, and they have already done that to some extent, right? But to the extent that that increases, then it means that the risks of escalation are increased. So every time the Biden administration, just for example, when we gave them HIMARS, right, the Biden administration gave them with provisions that the missiles that would be attached to them would only have a limited range, right? They don't want these missiles to be striking deep into Russia. There is another related issue that I think your question brings to mind, and it's connected, I think, to what you're asking. Why is it that the Russians have performed or underperformed in the manner in which they've done? And if you went back to January of 2022, nobody was expecting the war to play out on the ground in the way it has. You remember in the early days of the war, the Biden administration was offering Zelensky, right, travel outside of Ukraine, or at least somewhere safer in Western Ukraine, on the assumption that the Ukrainian government was going to collapse like a house of cards. And you remember Zelensky gives his very famous, response to that. He says, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." Right? The Ukrainians have, fought far beyond, anything that anybody had anticipated, and the Russians far below what people had anticipated. Why is that the case? There's two possible answers. One, a bad army. Two, a bad plan. I think the answer is both of the above, but let me just make a few quick comments on the bad plan part of it. You had 180,000 Russian troops invading Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe. And that's only if you say Russia is the largest. The Russians have been debating for centuries about whether a European country or not. 180,000 troops sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot to conquer a country the size of Ukraine. Russian military doctrine says you should start a ground war of this sort with a couple of weeks or more of an air campaign, soften up the defenses, disrupt the lines of communication. We didn't really see, as much of that as we anticipated. Cyber. Bring me back to January of 2022, and you ask me, what are the 2 or 3 countries in the world most capable of an offensive cyber campaign at the beginning of a kinetic war? Russia would be in that category. And yet, relatively little of an offensive cyber campaign at the beginning of the war. Why? I think the answer is pretty clear. Putin was anticipating, just like the Biden administration was anticipating, that the Ukrainians would not put up the kind of fight that they did. And if you make that assumption, right, you don't need that air war at the beginning. In fact, you don't want that air war because you don't want to destroy the infrastructure of the very country that you're now going to govern. Ukrainians are on their cell phones communicating with one another during the early days of the war. The Russians aren't disrupting those the technologies necessary for that communication. Again, why? They think this war is going to be over relatively shortly. And I think what they're thinking of is Crimea in 2014, right? Crimea is over before it begins. The little green men, the Russians without insignias, take over Crimea. There's very little fight and resistance. The United States does very little in response, at least not in the short term, right? And I think the expectation in the Kremlin was the same thing that was going to happen this time around.
Something quickly to this. Russ, so you gave 2 reasons. Remind me of what the first one. The second was it was a bad plan.
Bad army.
Yeah, bad army, bad plan. I would add another potential reason here, which is poor knowledge of Russia among Western scholars. Because very often, places where they do Russian studies, and this does not count at Dickinson, you're all very lucky to have, right, scholars who are working in the region in multiple languages, but very often, policy work on Russia is done by individuals who do not do work in the country, right, who don't read in Russian, who don't know Russian, who haven't had cultural who haven't done cultural study. And so anybody who's been doing years of research in Russia could tell you things about the Russian military and its structure that seemed to be left out of all of the analysis that was done in the months leading up to the war. So I would add that as a third potential, right? How would I put this? A lack of investment in holistic Russian studies, which includes language, which includes culture, which includes history, together with policy and strategy in U.S. institutions.
I'd like to add something to what Emil has said. It's my understanding, and I don't have insider knowledge, but it's my understanding that the Ukrainians putting on tax in Russia proper or in Crimea, they're going after the launchers. That's what they're targeting. They want to destroy the devices that lob long-range missiles, drones, et cetera, because they can't shoot them all down in the air. So what do? Send in commandos and you target that. That's why you see a lot of air sites, airplanes, bombers, long-range bombers being attacked. Why they're trying to sink some ships, and they've been successful with that. It's not like there are naval battles going on between the Ukrainian Navy and the Russian Navy. It's that those Russian naval ships lob cruise missiles. And so what do? You got to destroy the launcher, which is a ship. So then I don't think they're going to go after supply lines. I mean, Russia's gigantic. They can't do that. And their air defense, Russia's air defense is one of the best in the world. And the Ukrainians are using the same Russian air defense, right? And Russians are scared of their own air defense. So that's why their Air Force hasn't really been that active in Ukraine. So.
I was wondering, I know recently there have been a lot of shakeups within sort of the senior officers and like people leading the war campaign, like with Wagner taking a more leading role and such. I'm wondering if you expect, has the Russian army sort of worked out its kinks and found like who it wants to keep in its upper echelons in the military, or do you expect there will continue to be rotations with new people? You know, obviously Putin will be there for the foreseeable future, and Shoigu has stayed on board so far. So do you expect they've mostly worked that out, or it's going to keep on rotating?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. There's clearly a power struggle between Prigozhin, who is the head of the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is this mercenary group headed by a guy famously known as Putin's chef. He began as a restaurateur in St. Petersburg when Vladimir Putin lived and worked there in the St. Petersburg city government. They became knowledgeable of one another, worked together there. In any case, Prigozhin eventually evolves from a chef. A chef is really an understatement. His operation was essentially catering, huge contracts with the Russian military. He becomes eventually the head of this Wagner Group, this group of Russian of mercenaries who are associated with some of the worst abuses, right, that we see in the war. Abuses to their own troops, right? Taking Russians out of prison, promising them that if they survive what is likely to be a very difficult battle ahead of them, that they would be relieved of their need to go back to prison, and they can tell their families that they are now heroes. Whether they make it out dead or alive, they will be remembered as heroes of Russia rather than as former prisoners. In any case, the Wagner troops have been crucial, right, to many parts of the Russian campaign, including the battle for Bakhmut, which you've been reading about presumably in the newspaper over the past several months, right? Thousands of casualties on both sides in that battle, with the Wagner troops carrying the brunt of the load. But a lot of tension between Prigozhin, who has aspirations, I think, beyond being Putin's chef, and the military establishment, who he has been very openly criticizing in the Russian media. Very openly, right? And the real question is, where is Putin in all of this, right? Is he playing off the Ministry of Defense against Prigozhin and the Wagner Group? And depending on, the week and the month, the answer to that question looks a little bit different. So there clearly is a power struggle. I'm not sure it's resolved. 1 week Prigozhin seems up, the next week he seems down. But behind the scenes, there is no love lost between the military, the regular military establishment and Wagner's mercenaries.
I have a question about the recent news. There was a Chinese defense minister meeting with the Putin, and hails the military ties between those two countries. Mentioning the Poland, Moldova, and Belarus being possible enlargement sites of the war, actually Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan are kind of sensing increasing national security concerns. For these countries, will the tightening of the U.S. security ties or military ties, or pursuing their own military development be a good answer?
I would say that the connection between the Ukraine war and what might happen in Taiwan or in Asia it's a fixation in Washington, D.C. That's what I would say. D.C. policymakers care, number one, in terms of foreign policy and security policy. They care about China, right? And China's been identified as the number one adversary or competitor, however you want to couch it, of the United States. And so that means Russia is second, not secondary, but is number two, okay? And I know a lot of policymakers would want this war to be over or won or get finished and then turn full attention to China, because that seems to be the bigger game that is going on in D.C. And the lessons, there are certain tactical lessons being learned and applied towards Asia, what's going on. Ukraine's ability to defend, the way Russia invaded, the justifications that Russia used to invade. And so, in a sense, this is spurring Japan, Taiwan, South Korea to basically do a porcupine strategy, to make themselves so prickly to deter China from ever trying to conquer, encroach upon these countries with military force. Taiwan's a special case because of the one China policy and all the commitments there. But I think you see Japan. Japan has changed its military strategy. They're rearming in a big way. And that's all not because of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, but because Ukraine and Russia is an example of what might happen in Asia, and that overall geopolitical tensions have arisen. And it's not just because of the war, it's a lot of things. And Chinese aggression as well. So, and encroachment in South China Sea, elsewhere, you had the whole spy balloon thing, the fiasco that went on in January here. So I think a lot of Asian countries are waking up that they have a problem on their hands and they need to be more prepared.
Good evening. My name is Valeria Bising. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and my family is currently in Ukraine. I've been a Carlisle resident for 10 years. I appreciate you having this discussion. Obviously, I'm biased, but I appreciate it. And my question is for Professor DeBlasio. I've been in Kiev in September of last year, and I appreciate what you said about often we forget that it's about real people beyond the strategies and plans. What I think anecdotally, and this is just my humble personal opinion, we see in Russian society now is kind of what I would call themes of cannibalism, where some Russians are cheering on Ukrainian civilians being killed, tortures and rapes. Sometime the war will be over. We're concerned about how it will be over, but it will be over. Do you think there is ever kind of going back for Russian society to what we would call in a democratic country absolutely appalling, some of the things that are being said online. Do you think there is ever kind of going back and almost like purifying, if you will, for the society? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. And I would just highlight, you said this is just anecdotal or it's just my humble opinion, but I think that those things are so valuable because that's the stuff of art and that's the stuff of literature, right? The anecdotal personal experience. So I think, I appreciate why we tend to want to look at statistics, and I also value statistics. Individual experiences are important too. The question about is there any going back? I mean, that's a hard question. I always tell my students, I don't make predictions, right? That's not my field. That's not what I do. But I think there's something to be said for this idea that you raise about, and I can shift it just a little bit. I mean, if we look at Soviet history, there's a long history of both tension among Russia and Ukraine. There's a history of colonization by Russia to Ukraine. There's also a history of collaboration in art, in cinema, and literature. And so it's one thing I wonder is, will we ever get to that moment where we can, again, have these productive collaborations among people? I think that there's a long road before we get to that, right? There's a lot of pain that's been inflicted and is being inflicted. But as to your question about, right, the trajectory of Russian society, again, I think I would just say that it's hard to, and it's problematic to generalize, right? That we can see certain things online, but there are also plenty of people, many people in my circle who remained in Russia, or many people who left, who feel just absolute pain and shame about what's happening, and who have had to remain in Russia because they have elderly parents or they have no means of employment outside of Russia, right? And many who have left and feel that same pain and shame. And so I think here emotions are important. And I don't know, I can't predict what will be in the future, but there's going to be a lot of healing, right? A lot of healing to do. Yeah, thanks for that question.
So a question primarily for Professors Bova and Wolff. Since the start of the war, there's been quite a bit of speculation regarding whether the result is more or less successful, how Russia will be able to project its influence and act in the future, especially after the recent meeting between Xi Jinping and President Putin. So do you have any particular thoughts on the future strategic flexibility and potential for Russia to act as an independent great power?
Well, I'll just make a couple of quick comments, then I'll let Professor Wolff add it as he chooses. Keep in mind that it's a big world out there, right? And we in the West, right, assume that, everybody is on the side of Ukraine and everybody sees Russia as the evildoer. But if you go to other parts of the world, and I'm talking here not just about China, but if you look at the global South in general, there's a lot more ambivalence, if you will, right, about how to view the war. I don't remember the particular individual, but there was somebody from the Indian government who was recently having a conversation with somebody from some country in Western Europe. I can't remember the particulars. But his comment was, you Europeans think your problems are always the world's problems, right? We've got our own problems over, in our part of the world. So, as you look around the world, right, there are still places where, we use India as an example, where there's an extensive history of military relationships between Russia and India that go back to the Soviet days, an economic relationship between those two countries, right? And India is now, I think, officially the largest country in the world by virtue of population, just surpassing China. And China is number 2, and we know about the relationship there. So, it's a big world, right? And it's not all about, right, Russia's relationships with the United States and Western Europe.
Yeah, I mean, Russia's still going to be an important power, a great power, not a superpower, but a great power, influential. And I think this war, what this war shows is that sort of the 30-year dream of Russia being integrated into Western structures is gone, right? Russia's not getting back in the G7 or the G8. If there's peace tomorrow, they're not getting back. It's just not going to happen. No matter how the war ends, poorly for Russia or good for Russia or, you know, on equal terms, the West is going to distrust Russia. And economic ties, in buying energy, for example, Europe is I think they're committed to getting off of Russian oil and gas forever. So I think what this means in large geopolitical context is that Russia has severed its Western ties. It can't be recreated easily. You can't go back. If the war stops, you can't go back to the way things were just a year, 2 years ago. And it means now Russia is freer and more independent to have stronger relations with other parts of the world, China, India, Iran, countries in Africa, Nigeria, maybe Latin America. So I do think they're going to be more active in other parts of the world, in surprising parts of the world. And, you know, they may come back to sort of a amicable relationship with the West, but it's going to take a long time.
All right, we just have time for one more question.
I want to say I really appreciate the depth and breadth of this discussion tonight. It was very enlightening. We're first off to Ms. DeBlasio. One of the things about art in Ukraine in this war is all the YouTube stuff that's coming out. I mean, there's a great deal of expression that is very, very wide-ranging. Some very serious, some very deadly looking and things like that. And I think that may be another way of expressing what's happening for people. The other part I wanted to ask for the two gentlemen, what are your thoughts about the Zaporizhia power plant, and is it in real danger?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The media and the internet has given us a real glimpse into people's lives. And I mean, I've been collaborating with colleagues through Zoom who some have left Ukraine, some continue to stay. I mean, I have a colleague I'm collaborating with the windows were blown out of her apartment early on in the war, and then she moved to the basement, and we can only Zoom at certain times during the day because the electricity gets shut off. So we really get a glimpse into daily life, you know, what it's like. And daily life is going on in Ukraine. I mean, children are going to school, people are going to work, the symphony continues to run, and at the same time, there's war going on. So I think that's part of the process of artistic production during wartime. Artists have been, for instance, I've been to virtual shows of artists who have displayed pictures in bombed out apartment buildings, right? That's part of the installation, is using the scenes of war as the backdrop for artistic production.
I'm not a nuclear engineer, so I don't really know, what I can say about, how much danger that power plant in Zaporizhia is. All I would say is fighting a war in the area immediately surrounding a major nuclear power plant is probably not a good idea.
Yeah, and I would just add that the IAEA has said this is a problem. They've been able to inspect the site. But I think technically the issue is not that like a bullet or a rocket would hit it, but it's that the cooling system and the generators that keep the water flowing through the reactor would be somehow damaged or no more fuel. And this has already happened a couple of times where those emergency power generators have had to kick in. And if they stop, then there could be a partial meltdown. So we've been in some danger already, but the technicians there, I think, did Herculean efforts to stave off anything bad. Could it happen again? We don't know where this war is going to roam. And if fighting happens around there again, how's it going to get electricity? How's it going to get fuel? So it's a problem.
All right, thank you all so much. This concludes tonight's event. Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to our speakers.
Great job, Xenia.